Her fingers were broken, her legs shattered. But the confession still wasn't enough. The Inquisition chained her up again the next day and did it all over. Official records from 1606 show no apology, no pause, just a signed confession. Today, I'll show you facts about what medieval courts did to women accused of heresy, and why they called it worse than death. They dragged women into filthy rooms and called it justice. She wasn't there to prove her innocence. She was there to confess. The setup looked official: stone walls, wooden benches, men in robes. But this wasn't a real courtroom. After 1252, the Pope signed off on torture for anyone accused of heresy. They were branded as murderers of souls, which made anything done to them fair game. Once her name appeared in the records, that was it. In places like Germany, France, and Italy, church courts took control. From the 1400s to the 1600s, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of heresy or witchcraft. And most of them never saw a secular judge. These hearings weren't about facts, they were about speed. Clerics asked leading questions, then wrote down whatever answers kept the process moving. Even if she stayed quiet, they'd say her silence proved guilt. Inside that room, she had no power, no defense, no chance. They didn't come to hear her side, they came to close the case. They tied women down and jammed sharp metal between their legs. Once accused, women were forced into inspections. That meant stripped, shaved, and spread out in front of strangers. Judges claimed they were looking for witch marks, small scars, moles, or numb patches that supposedly proved a pact with the devil. If nothing turned up, examiners used pins and needles to poke until they found a spot that didn't bleed or react. That was enough to count as evidence. In England, Scotland, and parts of Germany, teams of men, and sometimes midwives, ran these searches. It didn't matter if the accused was respected or well-known. One woman was described in court as good-like, but still ordered to be examined. The process wasn't about finding the truth. It was designed to humiliate. They turned a woman's body into a crime scene before the trial even started. Even worse, they wrote it all down. Diagrams, descriptions, measurements, stored in court records to justify whatever came next. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It was legal evidence. They shoved hot irons at them and said, "Confess or burn." They didn't need to burn you to use fire as a weapon. In most trials for witchcraft or heresy, burning at the stake was the final punishment. But just the threat of it broke people. Church writers described fire as a glimpse of hell. That was the strategy: make the accused feel like Judgment Day started in that room. Joan of Arc's trial is a clear example. In 1431, judges told her that unless she gave up her beliefs, she'd be burned. Under that pressure, she gave in. Days later, she took it back. That sealed her fate. On May 30th, they tied her up and set the fire anyway. Executioners sometimes used ropes or gunpowder to make it faster, but only when they felt like it. For most women, they didn't. The burn was slow, public, and brutal. No one needed to light the fire in front of the accused. Just mentioning it was enough to get them to talk. They weaponized imagination, then backed it up with wood and flame. They made crowds watch as women were spat on and kicked. Trials didn't stay behind closed doors. They turned into entertainment. In Spain and Portugal, a public event called auto da fe turned sentencing into theater. Judges read verdicts in front of giant crowds, then marched prisoners through the streets toward execution. In 1680, one auto da fe in Madrid drew 50,000 people. Some just came to eat and watch. Local towns copied this format. Places like King's Lynn, or bury St. Edmunds set up scaffolds in market squares. People brought their kids. Some claimed they saw faces in the smoke or blood on the stones afterward. Those stories spread fast and kept fear alive. Being found guilty wasn't just a sentence, it was a show. Crowds screamed, mocked, and spat on the accused. Some threw stones. No one stopped them. Public shame became part of the punishment. Even before the fire, they were broken in front of their neighbors. This wasn't about law anymore. It was about control by spectacle. They ripped hair out by the fistful while asking about Satan. Interrogators didn't start with knives. They started with pain that looked simple. Hair pulling, slapping, yanking heads back, enough to disorient and terrify without leaving obvious wounds. Inside the torture chambers, methods were chosen carefully, not for mercy, but for deniability. The church had rules. Torture had to stop short of killing or permanently disabling someone, but there was no real oversight. So they worked just under the line. They could stretch joints, dislocate shoulders, tear skin, bruise organs, as long as you didn't die in the room. The goal wasn't to gather facts, it was to destroy resistance. One historian wrote that some prisoners were tortured, then brought back the next day for another round, still expected to speak clearly. They asked about Satan, Sabbaths, and secret rituals over and over again until the answers matched what was already written in the file. Everything a woman said was copied down. If she screamed or passed out, they wrote that too. If you didn't talk, they just pulled harder. They broke fingers, arms, and legs just to get a scream, finger by finger. That's how they started. One of the most used tools was the thumbscrew, a metal vise that slowly crushed fingers, toes, or knuckles with turning pressure. It didn't draw blood, but it caused unbelievable pain. In Scotland, they used it on children too. In one case, a woman named Alison Balfour confessed after her entire family was tortured in front of her. The next step up was the boot, a wooden or iron shell packed around the leg. Executioners hammered wedges into the gaps until the bone cracked. Some women passed out. Others screamed. That was the goal. Screaming meant progress. They didn't always go further. They didn't need to. These devices hurt badly enough to break the mind without destroying the body. And that was the balance they wanted. Victims had to survive long enough to testify and name names. Every injury became a tool, and every tool had one job: force a confession that fit the story already written. If the fingers cracked, the mouth opened. That was the math. They dunked heads in freezing water till women almost drowned. Cold water looked harmless. That made it easier to justify. In parts of Europe, courts used a method called swimming. The accused woman's hands and feet were tied. Sometimes she was fastened to a pole. Then they dropped her into a river or pond to see what happened. If she floated, it meant the water had rejected her, proof of guilt. If she sank, it meant she was innocent. But that didn't mean she was safe. People drowned during these ordeals, even with a rope tied around them. A 1600s manual said to tie the rope around her waist so she could be pulled out when she starts to sink. But by then, it was often too late. Crowds gathered to watch. Cold air, cold water, no mercy. Even if she survived, the damage was done. Floating meant she was going to court anyway, now marked as guilty by nature itself. They called it a test, but it was just slow-motion drowning with an audience. They starved women for weeks and laughed when they begged. Some women never got whipped, cut, or burned, but the pain still came, just slower. In Italian records, interrogators used sleep deprivation for up to 40 hours straight. In Scotland, it lasted even longer. One woman in Pittenweem was kept awake 5 days and nights. Guards watched her closely, waiting for hallucinations, stumbles, or contradictions. This method had a name: waking the witch. No food, no sleep, no warmth. Just constant questions and a body wearing down 1 hour at a time. Modern doctors call this psychological torture. Back then, it was just another tool. If the accused woman cried or shook or said strange things, it counted as a confession. If she passed out, it was seen as guilt. If she begged, they smiled. That was the moment they knew it was working. No marks on the skin, no blood on the floor, but the results were the same. They didn't need knives, just time, silence, and hunger. They forced confessions by threatening to torture family next. Pain didn't always come first. Sometimes they used something worse. Pope Innocent IV's torture order, ad extirpanda, included a line that changed everything. Heretics weren't just told to confess, they were also told to name others. That meant anyone they loved could be next: husbands, parents, siblings, children. Spanish Inquisition records show long chains of confessions. One prisoner named over 100 people. Why? Because that was the only way to stop the suffering. Some didn't even break under torture, but when the judges said they'd bring in a daughter or spouse, everything changed. If you stayed silent, someone else got hurt. That was the trap. Judges didn't need proof. They just needed names. And once someone was named, they were pulled into the same process, interrogated, inspected, and told to name more. So when a woman was asked about friends, godparents, neighbors, she knew what came next. One wrong answer could collapse her entire family. They made sure confession wasn't just survival, it was a trade. They crushed breasts and genitals with heavy stones and clamps. They didn't just target the mind, they aimed straight at the body. Interrogators used devices made for one purpose: to hurt the most sensitive areas. In some torture chambers, women were tied down and had their breasts or genitals crushed with weights, clamps, or stones. These weren't rare cases. They were written into the manuals, described step by step. The excuse was always the same: we had to be sure. Pain was the shortcut to that. They believed real witches wouldn't feel it or wouldn't cry out. So if a woman screamed, that was considered progress. If she didn't, they just added more weight. These methods didn't leave much visible damage from the outside, but inside, the trauma was brutal. Organ damage, internal bleeding, and constant risk of infection. They called it necessary. They called it justice. But the goal was clear: hit where it would break her fastest. They didn't just want a confession, they wanted it to come from pain she'd never forget. They left women in chains for days, covered in their own shit. Even between torture sessions, the punishment didn't stop. Once a woman was accused, she was thrown into a cell. No bed, no toilet, no light. In dungeons like Newgate in London, prisoners died from disease before even reaching trial. One year, 22 people died from what they called jail fever. Inside, women were often shackled to walls or floors. Some couldn't even lie down fully. If they needed to relieve themselves, they did it where they stood. No one cleaned it up. Guards avoided the smell. Rats didn't. The chains cut into their skin. Infection followed. Food was minimal unless family members paid for it. If no one could afford it, the accused lived on stale bread or nothing at all. They were trapped in darkness, covered in filth, waiting for a verdict that had already been decided. The cell wasn't just a holding area, it was part of the sentence. Even if the fire hadn't touched them yet, the system already had. They carved witch marks into skin and showed them off like trophies. They didn't just search for marks, they made them. In witch trials across Scotland and Germany, examiners were told to look for devil's marks, spots that didn't bleed, moles that looked strange, patches that felt numb. But when they didn't find any, they'd just keep pricking until something fit. Some went further. They cut or burned skin to create a mark, then called it evidence. These scars were shown in court, described in public records, and sometimes even printed in pamphlets to prove justice was done. The Malleus Maleficarum, a guide for hunting witches, claimed women were more likely to carry these marks because they were weaker in faith and more carnal. That was the logic behind cutting women open. If you looked hard enough, the devil's signature would appear. Even when the trial ended, the scars stayed. Visible proof that someone had once labeled her a danger. They didn't wait for the devil to leave a mark, they did it themselves. They let priests grope and examine every inch of their bodies. Priests weren't just running trials, they were inspecting bodies. In many cases, clergy supervised the full exam. That included shaving the woman, checking her skin, and watching her stripped in front of strangers. The church said it was necessary. They framed it as a moral duty. But the process was invasive, humiliating, and completely unchecked. The same men who preached purity were allowed to touch without restriction. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum argued that women were naturally corrupt, full of lust, and more likely to lie. That belief gave the church license to treat their bodies as open evidence. If a woman resisted, that became another mark against her. Refusal to undress was seen as proof she had something to hide. Consent was never part of the equation. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the process. The exams weren't private. Scribes stood by to take notes. Sometimes entire panels of men watched. They called it an inspection. But everyone in the room knew what it really was. They shoved women into cages hung outside to freeze or rot. Some women weren't burned. They were displayed. In towns across Europe, authorities used hanging cages, tiny metal frames that barely fit a human body. The prisoner was locked inside and suspended from poles or walls, left to die slowly in the open air. Sometimes they were already dead, just bones swinging in the wind, a warning for others. But in many cases, they were alive when locked inside. No food, no water, just cold nights, bird droppings, and the stares of every person walking by. There was no privacy. Every movement, every moan, every breath became public. Reports say children were taken to see them, told this is what happens to liars, to women who speak too much or go too far. The cages didn't just punish, they trained the next generation. Over time, bodies shriveled inside the bars, but the fear stayed fresh. They didn't bury their enemies, they hung them up for the town to memorize. They told men they could do anything they wanted, no punishment. Inside those cells and courts, women had no power, but the men did, and they used it. Church courts gave interrogators total control. They managed food, movement, questions, and punishment. If a woman cried or begged, it didn't change anything. But for guards and torturers, every order was an opportunity. Some records show guards trading favors for food, or promising lighter treatment in exchange for silence. In Salem, jailers charged families for blankets and meals. In other places, it got darker. Jailers groped, abused, and extorted prisoners, and most were never punished. When things went too far, Courts called it a mistake or a misunderstanding, rarely a crime. These men weren't afraid of consequences. They operated in a system that only looked one way, outward, never back at itself. The rules existed on paper, but in those rooms, no one enforced them. For women, every day in custody was a risk. For men, it was just another shift. They let mobs drag women by the hair through the mud before killing them. When the court let go, the crowd took over. In 1705, a woman named Janet Cornfoot was accused of witchcraft in the Scottish town of Pittenweem. She escaped prison, but villagers caught her, dragged her through the streets, beat her, and then crushed her to death under a door loaded with stones. No trial, no judgment, just rage. No one paid for her death. Investigators called it horrible and barbarous, but no real punishment followed. The message was clear. Once accused, you were fair game. And this wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe, mobs often gathered outside prisons. If a woman was released, they followed her home. If she was convicted, they spit on her, threw stones, or worse. The courts opened the door. The crowd finished the job. Modern researchers define this as lynching, an extrajudicial killing meant to send a message. And it worked. Once they called you a witch, anyone could become your executioner. They burned women alive and forced their children to watch. The execution wasn't private, it was staged. Women accused of witchcraft were often burned in public, sometimes alive, sometimes strangled first, depending on the region. In Scotland, most were strangled before the fire. In parts of Germany and France, burning alive was more common. Either way, it was loud, slow, and horrifying. Crowds showed up to watch. Children stood in front, parents behind them. Sermons were preached. People sold food. And if the accused had children, sometimes they were forced to stand nearby and watch their mother die. Joan of Arc screamed, "Jesus," as the flames reached her. That was 1431. Her case was famous, but many others were forgotten. Their names didn't survive, but their screams were heard by hundreds. The idea was to make it unforgettable. So the next time someone thought about challenging the church, they'd remember the sound, the smell, and the heat. The flames were real, but the fear spread even faster. They sold pieces of burned bodies as protection from evil. The killing didn't end with death. They kept using the bodies. Historians have uncovered cases where executioners sold pieces of burned flesh, bone, fat, and even hangman's rope. Why? People believed these pieces carried magical properties. The fat of a witch was used in salves. The rope she died from was kept as a charm. One scholar called it a dark market, a place where body parts were traded for protection, luck, or healing. It didn't matter if the person burned was guilty or not. Once the label stuck, the body became a tool, first for fear, then for superstition. Burned bones were crushed and mixed into potions. Some even took ashes from the stake and scattered them in their homes. Even after death, the accused had no peace. Their remains were still being cut up, sold, and passed around as souvenirs. Their bodies were used as warnings. Their ashes were sold as cures. They made families pay for the rope, the wood, even the execution or death came with a bill. In cities like Aberdeen and Lviv, families of executed women were sent invoices. Charges included ropes, wood, shackles, and the hangman's fee. In 1597, the execution of Janet Wishart cost £11 and 10 shillings for materials used to burn her. If families couldn't pay, the city seized property, land, tools, or livestock. In some cases, they even charged for prison food. During the Salem trials, Jailed women were billed for bread and board. If relatives didn't cover it, they starved. Hangmen made extra money selling pieces of rope used in executions. Locals paid for them as protection charms. The court called it reimbursement. But for families, it was theft. First, the trial destroyed their name. Then the system emptied their home. They didn't just burn the accused. They financially wrecked everyone left behind. Justice wasn't just brutal, it was profitable. They made sure the next woman in town knew she could be next. Fear didn't end at the scaffold. It lingered in every home. Even after the execution stopped, the memory stayed fresh. In 1782, a Swiss maid named Anna Goldie was beheaded, known now as the last witch executed in Europe. That was barely 2 centuries ago. She was cleared posthumously, but not in time to save her life. Across history, 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft. The vast majority were women. The message was clear. Be quiet, be obedient, be invisible, or be next. Modern historians say the witch trials became a template for control. Women who healed, spoke out, or challenged norms were the most likely targets. The system wasn't random. It was built to keep power where it already was. One historian called the witch label an identity forced on women, later reclaimed as resistance. But at the time, there was no reclaiming, only survival. Even after the fire died, the fear kept spreading. They buried the truth, but fear still follows women home. This didn't happen by accident. It happened by design. Church courts, local judges, mobs, and neighbors all played a part. They built a system that could strip a woman of her name, her body, her family, and her life, with no evidence, no defense, and no escape. That system shaped laws, traditions, and culture for centuries. And even after it ended on paper, the mindset survived. Women still get questioned differently, judged faster, blame harder. In some places, accused women are still burned, by courts, by mobs, or by rumor. The tools changed. The result wasn't. This isn't just history. It's a warning. Because everything you've just heard, it was all legal. It was all written down. And for hundreds of years, everyone acted like